The smoke curled upward like fingers searching for heaven, only to be dragged back down by the weight of sin. Her hands were bound behind her not tightly but ceremonially, as if to suggest that this was not punishment but purification. Around her the murmuring grew, a tide of voices swelling with every snap of kindling. The wood beneath her bare feet was damp with last night's rain, but already the heat began to crackle against her soles. The air was heavy with the stench of burning hair someone else's, from earlier that week, and the bitter perfume of scorched rosemary tossed into the pyre to mask what they didn't want to admit they were doing. Jeanne de Brigue stood with her head high, not out of defiance but something deeper, something quieter, a kind of surrender not to death, but to knowing. She had seen this moment coming long before the chains, long before the tribunal, long before the whispers. Her eyes searched the crowd, and for a second it wasn't fire she feared, but the silence of faces who once called her mother, healer, friend. The priest mumbled Latin. The executioner adjusted the rope. A child coughed. Then the flame caught, and Jeanne de Brigue began to burn. They called it justice, a sacred cleansing, a moral necessity. They wrote it into sermons, etched it into records, disguised it in Latin so the common folk wouldn't understand what was truly being said. The scribes called Jeanne de Brigue a diviner, a sorcière, a woman of dark arts. They said she conjured spirits and healed without the church's blessing, that she dared to speak when silence was safer, that her words cured fevers faster than relics, and that terrified them more than any demon ever could. But Jeanne was not a shadow dweller. She was not cloaked in mystery. She walked through the streets of Paris like any other, fetching herbs at dawn, delivering tinctures to doorways, whispering to frightened mothers with children in their arms. They forget to mention that. They forget to tell you that her hands brought comfort long before they were bound for burning, that she learned the healing arts from her mother, and her mother before her women who passed wisdom like bread in hushed kitchens and hidden gardens. The myth they sold you was this: that the fire was a warning, that her death made the city safer, that Jeanne was a danger to God's will. But behind the myth is a quieter horror, the truth that they killed her not because of what she did, but because of what she represented. A woman with knowledge outside the church, a woman trusted by the poor, a woman who answered prayers without priests. That was the real heresy. They didn't burn Jeanne to protect souls. They burned her to protect power. Long before the fire came for her, Jeanne de Brigue was a name spoken softly, like a prayer passed between lips that feared both hope and punishment. She was born in a time when the walls of Paris echoed with plague and poverty, when bread was worth more than gold and death visited often, without apology. Her mother was known as a midwife, but the people whispered other names: wise woman, charmer, seer. The church had a word for them too: sorcières, witches. But to the people in the alleys and muddy courtyards of the city, they were simply the ones who listened when no one else would. Jeanne grew up in that liminal world between piety and pagan memory, between prayer and potion. She learned to listen to the body the way others listened to scripture. She knew which roots bled poison and which sang healing. She watched her mother rub ash and honey on festering wounds, saw babies take their first breath in rooms too poor for candles, felt the trembling hands of men who hadn't slept in weeks soften under her whisper. Her knowledge was not written in books. It was buried in soil, pressed into petals, hidden in the breath between words. And people came, by the dozens. First neighbors, then strangers, women with miscarriages, men with fevers, children coughing blood. She never charged gold. Sometimes they paid in eggs or bread or just a nod of thanks and trembling hands. But with each healing her name grew. Jeanne of Brigue, not of nobility, not of wealth, but of healing, of results. and that made her dangerous. The church noticed. At first, quietly, a priest visiting her door with a polite warning, a suggestion that she redirect her gifts through proper channels. Jeanne smiled and offered him a poultice for his cough. He never came back. Then came the accusations. Subtle at first rumors that a man had died after her treatment, that a woman miscarried because of her touch. The Inquisition had been expanding across Europe, and in France the embers of paranoia glowed beneath every whispered name. Women with too much influence were easier to condemn than understand. But Jeanne remained. She kept healing, kept walking the muddy paths to knock on doors when babies cried too loud or husbands stumbled home vomiting bile. She spoke softly. She never cursed. She never claimed to wield anything other than patience and prayer. But for the men who wore robes and rings, that wasn't enough. Or rather, it was too much. Her real power was not supernatural, it was social. She had become a symbol of something terrifying, a woman trusted more than a priest. And in a world governed by patriarchal fear, that was the true witchcraft. The arrest came without warning. They did not knock, they seized. She was taken at dusk as the bells called the devout to evening service. They did not let her speak. In the records they claimed she confessed. But there is no mention of who translated her silence. No one asked why the herbs in her satchel were the same ones used by physicians in cloisters. No one asked why the people cried as she was dragged through the streets. Because by then a decision had already been made. Jeanne de Brigue would not be judged for what she did. She would be judged for what she represented. A woman unafraid. It began with a whisper. Not the kind that passes between children or lovers, but the kind that creeps into the corners of candlelit halls, sharp, deliberate, rehearsed. They said Jeanne had summoned spirits, that she used a brass basin filled with water to see things no one should, that she conjured shadows in rooms where the crucifix hung heavy and holy. They said she mumbled in languages that made the walls tremble. They said she cured the dying without prayer. That was the true crime, not that she failed, but that she succeeded outside the domain of God. No one knows who gave the testimony. In the records, the accuser is listed simply as a concerned neighbor. They came for her in the blue haze of evening. The sun had dipped behind the stone chimneys of Paris, casting long shadows through the narrow alleys of Saint-Germain. Jeanne had been kneeling in her garden, fingers buried in dirt still warm from the day's light, whispering over a sprig of rue. The guards didn't bother to announce themselves. She was seized like a criminal, her arms twisted behind her back, the herbs in her apron scattering like sins across the soil. They dragged her through the streets as dogs barked and shutters snapped shut. At the Châtelet, she was stripped of her name and given a title, accused. They did not call her a woman. They called her a vessel, a liar, a danger. The trial was not a trial, but a ritual, a performance masked as procedure. The inquisitors asked questions not to find truth, but to confirm a verdict they had already written in ash. Jeanne stood in a cold chamber lit by a single flame. They asked if she had seen spirits, if she had used water to speak with the dead, if she had made pacts, danced in moonlight, eaten forbidden things. She said no, but they recorded yes. And the city believed it or pretended to. After all, it was easier to burn one woman than to admit 1,000 had relied on her touch. Easier to cast her out than to question a system that blessed pain and punished healing. Her few defenders were silenced. One woman who had brought her child to Jeanne weeks earlier was found beaten in an alley. Another man, a cobbler who swore Jeanne had cured his infection, vanished overnight. Fear, after all, is the most obedient citizen. And somewhere beneath the cathedral bells and blood-stained parchment, Jeanne began to understand. This was not a mistake. This was a message. They would not let her live, not because they feared what she had done, but because they feared what she might inspire. The morning she was to die broke with a sky the color of old parchment, flat, silent, unfeeling. No birds sang, no church bells rang. Only the slow creak of wheels in the street signaled that something was being prepared. In a cell carved from the belly of the Châtelet, Jeanne de Brigue sat motionless, her hair damp from the frost that crept through the stones. Her gown, once plain but clean, had become a second skin of dirt and ash. She had not been allowed a mirror, but she did not need one. She could feel the way her face had thinned, how her wrists had become shadows of themselves, yet her eyes remained unbroken. They came for her not with cruelty, but ceremony. 2 monks walked ahead of the guards, murmuring prayers not for her soul, but for the satisfaction of those who would watch her burn. A priest read verses that asked for mercy but offered none. They bound her wrists not with iron but with rope, as if softness could cleanse what the fire would soon devour. One guard avoided her gaze, another held it too long. It was always the same men, unsure if they were punishing sin or suppressing something far more dangerous: memory. They led her through the streets of Paris on a wooden cart, her feet bare, her ankles trembling not from fear but from cold. The people lined the roads in silence, not because they agreed, but because speaking might place them beside her. Some children stared. A few women turned their heads. One man crossed himself and whispered a prayer not meant for God, but for forgiveness. The stake had been built in the square of Place de Grève, where the Seine ran close enough to smell but not close enough to save. It was tall, too tall, designed not for death but spectacle. Bundles of faggots had been stacked with surgical precision. The kindling was dry, the wind cruelly absent. A platform rose beside the pyre where clerics and nobles stood in their finery, their hands gloved in sanctimony. A banner of the church fluttered behind them as though the cross could soften what was about to unfold. Jeanne was led to the center, her feet crunching on straw and bone-dry twigs. A loop of rope was placed around her waist, another over her shoulders. Her hands, already bound, were tightened until her knuckles whitened. A priest stepped forward and offered her a final confession. She said nothing, not because she refused, but because she had nothing left to say. Her truth had never been welcome in words. The crowd began to murmur, not loudly, not rebelliously, but with the unease of people watching something they know they will carry home in their silence. Jeanne looked out at them not in accusation but in remembrance. Each face a page in a book she had once written with touch and tincture and whispered care. They would forget her name, but they would remember this fire. That she knew. The executioner stepped forward, a man whose job it was not to kill but to burn away symbols. He held the torch like it was a chalice. Reverent, detached, he touched it to the kindling, and the flame, as if reluctant, flickered into life. It did not roar, it breathed, it reached like a question. At first it was heat that rose, not pain. The smell of straw and dry bark filled the square. Then came the crackling, then the smoke. Jeanne did not scream. Whether by grace or exhaustion or the final mercy of collapse, her body did not resist the moment. But those watching felt something else ignite, something beyond flesh. The smoke rose and carried with it the unbearable truth that she was no witch, that this was not justice, that the fire was not cleansing but condemning, not her, but the world that needed her dead to feel righteous. As the flames wrapped around her legs, someone in the crowd began to cry. Not loudly, not theatrically, just one thread of grief unspooling in the cold air. A sound too human to be ignored. The church official raised his hand, calling for silence, not for reverence, but to drown it out. The priests resumed their chant. Latin echoed against stone walls, dull and hollow. The fire did its work. But something else remained. In the flicker of heat, in the dance of smoke, in the silence that followed the final breath, something ancient stirred. A realization, a memory, a wound. By the time the fire had consumed all but the blackened bones and brittle ropes, the crowd was already dispersing. The ashes would be swept away, the wood restacked, the square returned to its function. But the echo stayed, not in the air, not in the church, but in the people, who would go home that night and tell their children about the woman who did not scream. The ashes cooled by dusk. No monument was raised, no hymn was sung. Jeanne de Brigue's name was scratched into court records and then left to rot, ink fading beneath water stains and bureaucratic dust. But history doesn't always remember the way it's told. Sometimes it lives in the cracks, in breathless stories passed through kitchen walls, in dreams that wake with the smell of burning wood, in the ache of women who knew what had been lost but could no longer say her name. Paris did not mourn her publicly. That would have been rebellion. But in the days that followed, the streets seemed quieter, slower. Mothers who once brought their sick children to her door now lit candles without expectation. The sick stayed sick. The prayers went unanswered. And though the church claimed a victory against heresy, a strange sickness crept in, not of the body, but of spirit. The city had killed its healer. Some claimed the water near Place de Grève turned foul, that animals refused to pass the square, that a nun at the convent nearby woke screaming 3 nights in a row with her hands blistered, though no flame had touched her. Whispers, perhaps, or guilt dressed in ghost stories. But something had changed. An absence had settled over the alleys and markets, an absence shaped like a woman who once walked barefoot through the mud, carrying herbs and hope. For those who had known her, truly known her, grief did not come all at once. It came like rot beneath the floorboards, a slow unraveling, a hollowness in the chest when the fever rose and there was no one left to knock on the door. Some tried to mimic her remedies, but the plants died in their hands. The mixture soured. Healing is not a recipe after all. It is a relationship, and Jeanne had built hers with soil, blood, and trust. In time, her name was forbidden. Not officially, but culturally. Mothers warned their daughters not to speak of her. Midwives changed their methods. Young girls who once watched Jeanne mix oils in cracked bowls were taught to forget. To survive, they had to become smaller. But legends are stubborn things. One winter, 2 years after the execution, a child nearly died in the Rue des Marmousets. A desperate woman carried him through the streets, past doctors who asked for gold, past priests who offered nothing but prayer. In a final act of madness or memory, she went to the ruins of Jeanne's old garden. The frost had killed everything, but buried beneath the snow, she found a single sprig of rue. She boiled it with salt and water, as she had seen Jeanne do years before. The child survived. No one wrote it down. But the story lived, passed from mother to daughter, whispered under breath. And so Jeanne did not die completely. She became a ghost, not of fear, but of defiance. Her story became the caution not against rebellion, but against forgetting, against obedience to systems that demanded silence from the very voices that once kept others alive. In the quiet years that followed, other women were burned, other names erased. But something had begun, a crack in the ritual, a doubt in the process. Her execution was meant to be a warning, but for those who listened differently, it was an awakening. In the archives of the Châtelet, a single page remains. yellowed, torn but legible. It lists her name, her so-called crimes, and the method of her death. No mention of the children she cured, no word of the herbal garden she tended since she was a girl. No note of the families who owed her their breath. But in the margins, in a different hand, one line is scrawled, "She did not scream." Who wrote it, no one knows, but someone remembered. History has a way of cleansing itself. It scrubs away the screams, polishes the bones, and frames the ashes as inevitability. Jeanne de Brigue became one of many, one of thousands whose names flickered briefly in court records and then were smothered beneath the weight of official forgetting. To speak of her was to invite suspicion. To remember her was to risk becoming her. And so they buried her not just in fire but in silence. But silence is never empty. It is filled with breath held too long, with names whispered at night, with truths that survive in the blood of those who carry them forward. Jeanne did not rise again, not in body, not in law. But she returned in every woman who healed in secret, every mother who dared question the priest, every midwife who bent over a child with hands full of knowing. She lived in every refusal to bow, in every life saved by a leaf instead of a blessing. The men who sentenced her are forgotten. The priest who prayed for her soul is dust. The records sit in vaults no one reads. But Jeanne is still spoken in places history does not go. Her story is not unique. That is what makes it unbearable. It is one page in a book of fire, a book bound by fear and written by those who feared what they could not control. A woman with knowledge, a woman with power, a woman who healed without permission. What they could not take from her was her gaze steady even as the ropes tightened. They could not unmake the trust she had built. They could not burn the fact that people loved her, that the sick reached for her before they reached for God. And in that final breath, as the fire kissed her bones, something else was born. A warning. A whisper. A wound that would fester in the soul of a civilization. Because deep down they all knew this was not justice. This was memory, weaponized. And though the flames consumed her, the echo did not fade. It lives in the space between prayer and rebellion. In the eyes of every girl taught to be quiet but born knowing more. They tried to reduce her to ash, but ash returns to soil, and soil remembers.